Hello there, John Guturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, thank you to everybody who makes it possible for me to live my vision every day, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life to help you with your goals, or as a listener or supporter of the podcast. Thank you to everyone. Today's episode is on the topic of parenting, and I'm going to be having a somewhat intensive discussion on some of the important facts about parenting that often aren't well understood, but which are absolutely essential if we are to be good parents. Now, I'm going to emphasize before we start that, as per usual, what you find on the internet, including on my podcast, is not professional advice and should not be taken as a direction of what you should do. If you have concerns of any description, build a rapport with a professional, seek professional advice. Do not take advice from the internet. Now, to begin, I recently recorded an episode with my collaborator Ebony Wamaki on the subject of parenting, and it was an incredible discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and Ebony's insight is fantastic, and if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you listen to that episode and listen to some of Ebony's content, because she, as a mother and as a well-being professional, has incredible insight into the types of issues that are involved in important endeavors such as parenting. Parenting being such a complex and difficult role, and also being the world's most important role, is never going to be a perfect practice. There are always going to be flaws. We're human. We're always going to have flaws ourselves. We're always going to make mistakes. But any opportunity that we can take to be critically minded and consider how we can do what we do more effectively is going to be worthwhile. Over time, overall trends in how we raise our children seem to have shifted. At one time, harsh punishment was the accepted practice. Children were meant to be seen and not heard, and if something bad happened to a child, often they weren't believed. It was believed that parenting was just something that we should do without thinking, that we had a duty to nature or to God or to whichever entity in which we believed as part of our religious or philosophical framework, to have children, to reproduce and to continue the family, and that harsh punishment, including physical punishment, was the only way to make a child civilized and mature. We've shifted that now to being more understanding of the role of emotions and the role of other factors which were previously not considered in how children develop psychologically. And there have been both positive and negative consequences of that. And as always, whenever there is any type of idea in society, there are polarized responses to it. Some people are quite attached to this new idea and aggressively defend it, even against people who may only slightly disagree with it. And then there are people who are adamantly against it and will criticize and evaluate as negative anyone who agrees with the idea. And as I've always said, ideas don't become popular because they're truthful, they become popular because they appeal to people's emotions. And when people are polarized, the likelihood is that they're not being logical. What they are is trying to prove themselves are right because it gives them a sense of personal satisfaction and security. But let's examine some facts about parenting to start, and facts about how children develop. First of all, many people shun emotions. They say they're for soft people. They say mature people have to be stoic, not showing emotion. Emotions are irrational. Emotions have no place in logical thinking. When you're an adult, you have to simply be unemotional. Now, emotions do have their negative consequences, and they can lead us to be irrational, but they are an important part of our development, and in order to develop properly, we need to have a healthy relationship with them. Otherwise, whether you like it or not, our minds are not going to develop optimally and we can come to harm. So this is a fact. We need a healthy relationship with our emotions. And in fact, emotions can actually be conceptualized as having an evolutionary purpose. When we have an emotion, our body reacts to it often. We can actually feel certain physical sensations that relate to that emotion, and our minds tend to focus on all the information that is linked to it. So we could say that those emotions are essentially internal signals that we should focus on a particular factor in our environment or a particular idea. From an evolutionary standpoint, when we acknowledge that point of focus, we are aiding our survival in some way. Now, another fact is that what adults deem common sense is often not necessarily innate. That we do have innate senses, and certain ideas are inherently true, but a lot of these ideas have to be developed, meaning that when children are born, they don't inherently hold these ideas. They have to learn them through experience and through being taught explicitly. Children don't have the cognitive capacity to understand a lot of the ideas that we hold to be common sense either, which is why they need to be guided gently when they're younger, and then as they develop that cognitive capacity, taught those ideas in an appropriate manner. Children also understand more than they can communicate. Often, their mind is processing information in such a way that has a direct relationship with what they're being exposed to. So when a child is, for example, displaying a lot of emotion, for example, they're screaming or they're crying or they're expressing even intense joy or hyperactivity, often that emotion is all they have to express their needs because they haven't yet developed the cognitive capacity to express them in more rational, so to speak, means. What's also a fact, again, whether we like it or not, is that the brain has a role in everything to do with how we function. Okay? And if you don't believe this, ask yourself this question. If I cut out my brain right now, would I be able to function? Different emotional states actually have different neurological correlates. And those neurological correlates can also affect areas such as logical thinking and self-regulation. And sometimes the way that the brain works makes it actually impossible to function in certain ways given certain cognitive states. And if we deny that fact, we're effectively denying the role of the brain in anything. Because if we can believe that the brain controls our body, our breathing, our memory, and so forth, then what makes it so difficult to accept that our brain can actually control our emotional state and through that also affect how well we can engage in certain types of thinking? If we deny the role of emotions or we don't tend to them properly, then there is also a risk that we will develop longer lasting, harmful cognitive tendencies, psychological tendencies, that then pervade the way we live our lives throughout the rest of our existence, unless we address them properly. And that is a fact, and we see it often. The challenge in parenting is knowing how to teach our children appropriate behavior and enacting appropriate discipline without disrupting healthy emotional development. There are a number of ways that children learn. They can be taught ideas directly. You as a parent can teach your children to do certain things or not do certain things. They can also learn behaviorally, which means they observe the consequences of their actions, evaluate whether those consequences are desirable or undesirable to them, and then choose whether or not to enact those same behaviors in the future based on how desirable the consequences were. If a child reaps undesirable consequences such as punishment from a particular behavior, they may be less likely to do it in the future. Not always, but it's a way that a child can learn. If they reap positive consequences, they may be more likely to do it. They can also learn socially, which means they learn by interpreting the context of not just what happens to them, but what happens to other people. And they can observe how other people behave and what consequences they receive, and then judge whether or not they should do the same behavior based on what they observe. And this is highly complex, and often the child is interpreting not just directly what they see, but they try to interpret contextual information as well. If a child is not shown a healthy balance between discipline and leniency, they may develop problems. As I said, often children don't have the cognitive capacity to fully understand what's happening in the world, which means often when you punish a child, especially a young child, they may not learn effectively from it because they may not actually understand what they did wrong. Or they may feel they're being punished for expressing needs because what we deem to be bad behavior, such as them screaming or crying, was actually the only way that they knew how to act in order to potentially have their needs met. Remember that from an evolutionary standpoint, our bodies and minds are designed to help us survive, which means that if we perceive that our needs not being met is a threat to us, which we're designed to think in order to prompt us to then seek those needs being met so that our basic survival needs are met, then we are going to react rather intensively to it because it instills in us a fear that if we don't have our needs met, then something bad is going to happen to us or that we could die. Our minds are designed to think that way by nature because our minds want us to survive. A child doesn't necessarily have the cognitive capacity to critically evaluate what is really a threat to them and their survival and what may not be so much of a threat. And often they're working based on instincts that tell them that certain events may be threatening when they're not necessarily as threatening as they may seem. That's all a child knows. If you punish them in instances in which they genuinely believe that they're trying to have their needs met, not only are you being cruel, you're also teaching them destructive ideas. Now, what can happen if we don't teach our children to have a healthy relationship with their emotions, or we respond in an inappropriate manner to them? When a child interprets the context of what it is that's happening, they can develop all sorts of distorted ideas if they're not treated appropriately. One of these is people pleasing. If a child learns that anything they do, including asking for their needs to be met, is going to result in punishment, they may interpret that as meaning that in the world, that is all they're going to receive from other people. Negative consequences for trying to have their needs met. And they generalize it to every situation. And a people-pleasing tendency may develop from that. A people-pleasing tendency is when the child's interpretation that then endures for the rest of their life is that if other people are going to react negatively or are likely to react negatively, I'd better make strenuous efforts to be nice to them so that they don't have a reason to react negatively. It can also be a result of a distorted belief that they are to blame for everything. Remember, as I've discussed in my content, that our minds are designed to use heuristic thinking, which means they're designed to try to make quick judgments so that we can make decisions and survive in the world. A child often thinks in an overly simplistic fashion, which means that if something bad is constantly being done to them, they will try to find the most logical explanation for that in order to make a quick decision about how they should respond, while also subconsciously maintaining a sense of order, or the idea that the world is a fair, orderly place in which everything happens for a reason. So if something bad is constantly happening to them, they may well conclude that they were to blame for it, because that seems to be the simplest explanation. And they can develop people-pleasing tendencies from that because they have learned that they owe the world something. They are such a bad person that they need to then compensate for their bad qualities by showing other people positive qualities. They need to show people, I know that I'm bad, therefore I should be subservient to you because you deserve this, but I don't. What can also happen is emotional reactivity, and people can become emotionally reactive to situations that logically don't warrant it. This happens when a child is not taught healthy emotion regulation. If a child is constantly receiving negative feedback in response to their emotions, they may learn a number of lessons from that. One is that the world will never meet my needs, and so I have to try extra hard and give extra emotional intensity to my expression in order to show people that I have needs and hopefully someone will listen to me. Or alternatively, born of their self-blaming or people-pleasing tendencies, or their observation of their parents not responding in a particularly regulated manner to emotions, they may develop quite negative emotions themselves and they have no way of controlling them. If a person constantly carries the idea with them that they are to blame for everything, they may respond not necessarily just by people-pleasing, but by expressing those emotions outwards, being constantly angry, constantly sad, constantly reactive or agitated, because emotion control is a limited resource, and when someone has all those emotions but have no way of controlling them, then eventually they may move outward. If they feel they're to blame for everything, then they're constantly going to carry the unconscious idea that the world is a dangerous place in which no matter what good they do, they're always going to be to blame. They're always going to be a bad person. Imagine how distressed you'd be if you had to carry that idea with you every day for the rest of your life. Eventually, your emotions would show in some way. You'd have no way of controlling them. Also important to understand is that emotional control is a learned skill, and so children have to observe their parents regulating in order to learn how to regulate themselves. It's something that's not innate. If a child never witnesses that, then they're never going to know within themselves how to do it. This may then also develop into more pathological tendencies such as narcissism, which is an intensive need to be noticed and validated and seen as superior to others, born of a lack of empathy and a lack of self-confidence that leads people to then take every opportunity to fulfill their own needs to the point of disregarding other people's needs or exploiting other people in order to have their own needs met. And narcissistic tendencies, which can become abusive in future relationships and exploitative, can result from one being the victim of narcissistic abuse themselves or being the victim of emotional insensitivity when they were children. Whether you like it or not, these are facts, and I can tell you this as someone who not only survived trauma himself, but have counseled countless individuals who have suffered at the hands of parenting and environments in which they were not taught to have healthy relationships with their emotions, their needs were not met, and known people personally who are in that same situation. It's a fact that emotions are part of our lives, they're here to stay, they're part of being human, and we need to have healthy relationships with them. Now, there are also a number of fallacies that result when people don't understand this important theory, and there are negative consequences from them. One of the possible consequences is parenting that is too lax. Some people believe if I'm too harsh or too disciplinarian, then my children will grow up to be emotionally damaged, which is true, as I'm about to explain. But if the parenting that results is too lax, children don't learn to behave well. And I can tell you this from my schooling years. There was a lot of dysregulated behavior and a lot of hooliganism. And people say, well, that's just children being children. Not necessarily. Children and adolescents do have quite strong emotions. Yes, it's a time when they can have trouble regulating them. But effective parenting can teach children to regulate their emotions well. Okay, yes, we do have different temperaments. And yes, to a certain extent, the school system doesn't properly acknowledge that children have different needs and help them to meet their needs in ways that are still productive and socially acceptable. But at the same time, effective parenting can teach a child to express their needs in a healthy manner without having to be submissive. A child has to observe their parents behaving in a regulated manner. And at the same time, natural order suggests that people need structure. Our brains function on structure, routine, and a sense of predictability and a sense of what we should and shouldn't do. Even though a healthy mind knows how to adapt to change and adapt to contingencies and unexpected events, children will ultimately be much happier and have a much healthier relationship with themselves and others when, as children, they're taught to behave in a regulated manner and they're disciplined not in a harsh manner, but in a manner that is appropriate. That is to say, their parents show them negative consequences result from certain bad behaviors, but rather than using physical punishment and rather than deriding their children, if a parent shows a child, these are the negative consequences that are going to result from these types of behaviors, and then teaches them, this is why you're receiving these negative consequences. And it's because in the future, if you do this, what you do may affect other people negatively, and if other people do it, it may affect you negatively. And then also outside, and then giving them equal praise when they enact good behaviors, children learn a healthy sense of right and wrong. They learn there are reasons why we consider certain behaviors to be bad, certain reasons why we consider certain behaviors to be good. And I can contribute to the good by enacting good behaviors, and I can also meet my own needs. And if parents show their children empathy as well, and show them that they understand why they may enact certain behaviors, and also show them how to meet their needs without having to resort to bad behaviors, then that child can develop a healthy sense of regulation and be disciplined, healthy, and respectable without being too rigid, self-hating, and ultimately bitter. It's difficult, but I'm telling you, if you want parenting to be easy, you haven't chosen it for the right reasons. Parenting is not about a life of ease. It's a difficult role, and you need to be willing to put in the effort, because ultimately that's the only way that your children are going to have a healthy childhood. Now, the polar opposite of this fallacy is what happens when children are disciplined too harshly. Certain parents will espouse the idea that children will grow up undisciplined. You'll have anecdotal evidence. People saying, well, I was hit when I was a child and I was all right. Well, there are two fallacies there. Number one, in my experience, professionally and personally, I've never met someone who was physically beaten as a child or was subject to this type of harsh discipline and is actually psychologically healthy. And if I was to analyze a lot of the people who make this claim, I would see psychological problems in them as well. Also, anecdotal evidence in and of itself is just not valid, because our mind does filter information and it looks at it, it analyzes information in a biased fashion. If we're taught as children that abuse is justified, then our minds have been primed to only see the justification in abusive instances without analysing the information to demonstrate that that abuse is not justified and that it is actually harmful and not beneficial. I've talked a lot about cognitive bias in my program. It happens to all of us and we're often unaware of it. So if you genuinely believe that child abuse is justified as a form of discipline, and you think that you're all right, the likelihood is you probably have some problems below the surface. But that's for you to decide. And if you have concerns of your own, please seek professional advice on it, because a trained professional will be able to analyse with you where those problems might be, if they're existent. Then there are a number of hypocritical tendencies that people espouse when they take this approach that harsh parenting is absolutely necessary. There are people who will espouse the idea that all these advocacies for mental health are all myths and that they're some type of political conspiracy to try to make society weak, and that psychotherapists are grifters and they put funny ideas in people's heads. Well, let me ask you this question. If therapists can put funny ideas in people's heads, what makes you as a parent think that how you emotionally raise your children doesn't affect them later. An irony is that individuals who often espouse this and say that psychotherapy and mental health advocacy is all a myth and all a conspiracy are exactly the types who weren't raised well. And as I said, most likely they're uncomfortable with emotions because they witness their parents not having healthy relationships with their and their children's emotions. And what I see in a lot of these people is bitterness and hatred about the world, and they, instead of acknowledging it and looking inward and saying, I have some problems that I have to address and resolve in my life, they will turn that outwards and say, no, I'm all right, I'm the mature person. It's the rest of the world that has gone politically correct. It's the rest of the world that's gone woke. It's the rest of the world that is too sensitive and too obsessed with catering to their emotional needs. I'm justified in the way that I raise my children, and it was justified that I was raised the way I was. It's everyone else's fault that children are not disciplined. Then there are people who will take it a step further and say, well, when I hit my children or get angry, it's not my fault. I was raised in that environment. I didn't know any better. But then those same people will look at others who are dysregulated and say, you're an adult now. You should know better than to behave that way. This is not about excusing anyone. It's also not about blame. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm not saying that you don't deserve help. In fact, it wouldn't be worth me talking about these issues if I didn't believe that people deserved help, right? You are worth helping. And I've helped people who have potentially also enacted abusive behaviors towards others as a result of them not having a healthy sense of emotional regulation born of how they were raised. Yes, you are absolutely worth helping, and you absolutely deserve the same empathy and compassion. And if you were to come to my counseling practice, I would show you the same empathy and compassion and consideration and empowerment that I would show somebody who was a victim of abuse. But one of the most important aspects of being a helping professional, and indeed educating people well, is telling you what you need to hear, even if you don't want to hear it. And while as adults, blaming other people for our behavior is not healthy, and indeed, me as a trauma survivor, I have enacted behaviors that are ineffective. I have made mistakes, and I don't take it upon myself to blame other people for my current behaviors. I recognize that I have to take responsibility for how I develop in life, and even though what happened in the past may have caused my emotional difficulties, that doesn't mean that I have no choice in how I deal with the present. When we are emotionally dysregulated, it affects our mind's ability to process information and to use that information to enact behaviors. That's called executive functioning. It doesn't mean that we have no control over behaviors. It just means that the range of behaviors that we can enact are more limited because some of the more complex behaviors and responses require brain activity that is impeded when we're in those emotional states. But I can make choices that are less harmful, less destructive. And I also can communicate that I'm making those choices for a reason in order to maintain my relationships. I had to learn that. It wasn't easy, and it's certainly not magical. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of sacrifice, but it is possible. And the only way that I was able to do that was by looking inward and asking myself, I know that certain bad events happened in the past, but what can I control right now? What choices can I make? Because ultimately, no one else can make those choices for me, and no one else can do the work for me. I have to. And that's why I've devoted my life to educating people in this way, because people are worth helping, and you are worth the change. What I'd also like to do is warn people to be very careful of what I call child worship, or the ideology that we should have children because we have a duty to, and that we have some level of righteousness for having children that isn't present in people who don't have them. When we treat parenting as a right and treat being a parent as some type of righteousness and use it to obtain some kind of status of righteousness in our minds, this is not healthy. All right? We inevitably treat our children as assets if we do that. It becomes a platform for a dogmatic belief. And when we see abusive parents, people who have clearly a very hateful, bitter, spiteful outlook on the world and are constantly expressing negativity, often what's happening is those people weren't taught to have a healthy relationship with their goals and with themselves. They reproduce on instinct. And often what happens is we've been led to believe that having children in the eyes of our particular religious philosophy or social philosophy or political beliefs is necessary for us to be fully mature and for us to be righteous individuals. And we do that because we have this intensive need to be self-validated and to believe that we are good people. And sometimes we will do anything to enhance that belief. There's only one reason for which you should have children, And that is because you have a natural inclination from nature to show love to another being and to help that being become an actualized individual in which they will do great things for the world and have a great relationship with themselves and others, and that they can bring something new to the world. If your devotion to having children is not of that nature, that you want to raise children because you have love to give and you feel that inclination to give that love to a human being who will love you back and to help them become something wonderful in the world, whatever that may be for them, whatever unique qualities they may have, you're probably not being a parent for the right reason. You should not have children just because. You should not have children because my parents made me. You should not have children because, well, I have to. It's the only way I'm going to be an adult. I can tell you, if you have children on that basis, you're seriously risking not bringing the right attitude with it. And you're seriously risking causing emotional harm to your children. Because if your mind is only focused on what the benefits are to you, or what you feel your obligations are, you're not going to be able to focus on the natural desire and motivation to then raise your child in a healthy, compassionate manner. And this is where emotional problems develop. You shouldn't treat having children as just something fun to do. Okay, as Ebony said in our collaborative episode, you only have that little baby for a very short period of your life. Then they become a child and then a teenager and then an adolescent. And raising children at that age takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of devotion. It takes a lot of patience. If you don't have your life together and you don't know that you're in the right position to be able to give that child what they need, you're doing them a disservice. And in the end, if you're the one choosing to have the child, but the child has no choice themselves, whether they come into the world or not, if you only do it for your own purposes because you think it'll be enjoyable, you're not bringing with it the right attitude and you're potentially going to harm that child. You have to take responsibility and say, I'm dealing with another living, breathing being here. Am I going to be able to give them what they need? It's absolutely critical, and yet too many people don't have that devotion to doing what's right, and that's where emotional problems result. There's a common situation on which I'd like to comment as a final topic in this discussion, and I'm not going to say that any one group is responsible for it, but I am being critical of it wherever it happens because it is a highly dangerous and incredibly pathological situation. It's a situation in which trauma is transmitted generation to generation and which parents refuse to break the cycle of it by continuing to repeat the parenting patterns of their own parents. And I've seen certain types of families on a number of occasions. Parents who were subject to emotional neglect and physical abuse themselves then become emotionally neglectful parents. Often one person in the couple is abusive and the other person is rather gentle and submissive, and they became a couple because one person was submissive and was looking for love wherever they could find it, and the other person was a narcissist who recognized that submissiveness and took advantage of them, convinced them to form a relationship and have a child with them, and is now showing their true colors because ultimately that's what a narcissist does, exploits other people for their own benefit. And both justify what they do using extremely destructive pathological logic. They'll then have children who become traumatized. And even in situations, which I've seen happen before, in which the parents recognize that their behaviors contributed to their child's trauma, they still espouse destructive ideas about parenting. They still have this obsession about other people in the family having children, about their own children having children, so that they can have grandkids and do their duty to nature or do their duty to their religion or whichever framework to which they believe. And what's also ironic and incredibly hypocritical is that it's often from this particular subsector, this particular philosophical sect, in which people are constantly complaining about pedophilia and saying certain philosophies are pedophilic or trying to groom the children. Yes, pedophilia is bad, but it's also pedophilic to treat children as assets and exploit them. Even if you don't realize you're doing it, you could unintentionally be grooming your children to believe in your own philosophical ideas and teaching them not to question them. And as I've said, no one is wiser than nature, and no one is wiser than objective truth, which means if you're teaching your children to dogmatically uphold your ideology and what all they've seen from you is abusive behavior, even if they don't recognize it consciously, they're going to internalize those behaviors and they could potentially then become abusive parents themselves. This is avoidable. You just have to be willing to look in the mirror, get the right advice and say, am I really in the right position to be doing this? And what is my role in this situation? If you don't take that responsibility, you could just be another manipulative parent. You could be exploiting other people because the sense of control gives you a sense of righteousness. You don't want that to happen, but it is avoidable. I need to say this blatantly. Let's stop this rhetoric about excusing domestic violence and excusing bad behavior. I've heard people espouse these ideas. Why do people always have to say they're mentally ill these days? In my day, we just accepted that our parents had bad tempers and hit us every now and again. They were just doing their best. They were loving us. Or, your triggers aren't my problem. If you're emotionally soft, deal with it and grow up. Or making jokes about mental illness and treating it as political correctness. Or treating hitting children as a joke. Making jokes about abusing children and treating it as edgy. Let me ask you a question about hitting children. If you could hit your child because they didn't do what was right, or you think it's justified, where should I be allowed to hit you as an adult? If I meet you in public and you make an offensive comment towards my partner, am I allowed to hit you? How would the police see that? And how would you see that? Would you justify why you shouldn't be hit? It's a slippery slope. We decide on how to deal with certain situations by extrapolating logic and forming precedents. If we accept a precedent that it's okay to hit our children, where do we stop extrapolating that logic? As I've said, so much of this is about denying responsibility for what we do. You show me someone that says, kids these days have no discipline, I was hit and I was all right, and has a bitter outlook about absolutely everything that happens in the world and ultimately wants to call everything in the world toxic. I see someone who was not raised well, and I see someone who needs help. And as I said, you are worth helping, and you deserve the same quality of help as anyone else, but the first step to changing is being willing to stop blaming other people for what you do and saying, right, I'm responsible for this now, what can I do? So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, if you have any concerns at all about anything, please seek professional advice. Speak to those you love as well. And if you have any ideas about what you would like to see on the program, or you'd like to be a guest or a collaborator, please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, take care.